Welcome to the last research lunchtime presentation of the semester and of the year. Today we will be hearing from Dr. Tom Bowman, who is originally from Central Pennsylvania. He received his bachelor's degree in athletic training from California University of Pennsylvania. Afterward, he earned an MED in kinesiology and a PhD in higher education from the University of Virginia. He currently serves as a professor in the Department of Athletic Training here at the University of Lynchburg. He has taught a wide variety of classes, including upper extremity examination, kinesiology, research design, and thesis since joining the university here in the fall of 2004. His research interests include head, neck injury in sport, protective equipment performance, and socialization in athletic training. He was named a fellow of the National Athletic Trainers Association in 2022 for national and international excellence in athletic training, research, and scholarship. Much of his scholarship has included mentoring student research projects at the undergraduate or graduate level, leading to several student research awards. He is a fellow of the University Research Center and my colleague, and I am delighted to introduce him to you today. I am Dr. Robin Bates, also a fellow of the University Research Center, and today he'll be speaking about improving athlete safety by studying head, neck injury in sport. Dr. Tom Bowman.
Thanks very much, Robin. So I've never done anything like this before where I have a broad audience of folks from a bunch of different backgrounds. So I'm going to do my best today to go an inch deep and a mile wide on some of the work that I've done since I started at the university here almost 20 years ago. First, my disclosures: I do have grant funding from the entities up on the screen, although the grant funding does not, will not affect any of my message today. I always like to be upfront with the funding that I've received. So this is my my attempt at artwork. I would have failed kindergarten if it was solely based on artistic ability. My students hear me say that all the time. This is my framework for what I do, right? And so I look at athlete healthcare, and I look at it in kind of three different areas: concussion assessment and treatment, injury prevention, and protective equipment. And ultimately, all three of those hopefully are relating to improved player safety. So what I'm going to try to do here is take you kind of through a walk through time. One person, Ed Holloway, some of you probably remember Ed, when I was a very young faculty member here, he told me that your research agenda should be like an airport, where there's always something landing, there's always something taking off, there's always somebody going through baggage claim, there's always somebody checking in. And so you should have your projects in different areas. And so that's what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to tell you about some things that I've done in the past, some things that I'm currently working on, and some things that I hope to do in the future. So let's start with the head. So I worked with a slew of students on head impact biomechanics during sport participation. And I think this provides context to really think about how we can prevent injury from occurring. So the first study, this is Kathleen O'Day. She graduated a number of years ago. She's an undergraduate student here. She's working up in New England at a high school now as a clinician. So what we first did is take a look at head impacts in men's lacrosse. We started small because we wanted to make sure we could actually handle it, and then we expanded out to some other sports. So she took a look at games and practices and location of the impact, right? And so what we found was impacts to the side of the head were quite common during practices, but then we had kind of three areas on the head during games that they were relatively equal: the back, the front, and the side. When you look at the magnitude of those impacts, though, side tended to have a lot, but they were relatively low magnitude. And so, I think that helps us provide, some context for where these are happening so that we can think about prevention initiatives. So the QR codes on the screen go to the full text of the article. If you are interested, you can swipe that with your phone and catch the article. So really what we thought here is, impacts to the side of the head might be problematic because in other sports they have been found to be the mechanism for injury more often than other locations. So this is a little bit concerning. Then we took a look at, well, like, what's actually causing the impacts to occur? This is Rachel Lee. She's a faculty member down at Mercer now. She got her PhD at Georgia just a few years ago and finished out. So she was an undergraduate here and finished her project with me. So we took a look at, well, what is the actual mechanism behind the impact to the head? And what we found, interestingly, in the men's game, it's head to body and stick to head. And in the women's game, it's head to body and stick to head. Both of those all of those mechanisms between the two sexes are illegal during gameplay. So if that is the rule of the sport, perhaps enforcement needs to be improved to help reduce head impacts. So then we took a look and we wanted to work with our soccer teams too. We don't have football here. The majority of the literature to this point was done in football, so we branched out to soccer. We found a measurement tool that worked for non-helmeted athletes as well. And so this is Tabitha. She works down in the Charleston, South Carolina area now. She graduated a few years ago. And what we found was increased magnitude from ball to head impacts during soccer. What do soccer players do? They use their heads, not their arms. Kind of makes sense. And so what we thought about is, well, how can we maybe reduce the frequency of these head impacts? We found a lot of body to head contact during the men's game and more ball to head contact during the women's game. So maybe we can work during practices to reduce the number of ball to head impacts that they receive. Maybe during games we work on positional awareness so that when players go up for a 50-50 header, they're not making contact with somebody else's elbow or shoulder or what have you. And then this is Sarah Cornell. She's working down in the Atlanta area now. We also took a look at head impacts from a location perspective in our soccer athletes. And we found that the impacts to the side of the head were relatively low magnitude. And so what we're thinking here is, again, not all that surprising. When soccer players head the ball, they usually swing their head to direction it, right, towards the goal if it's a set piece in the box. And so, maybe there's some things we can do to help reduce head impact frequency in soccer. So during the 4 years that we collected this data, we had several student athletes become injured, right? They sustained concussions while they were wearing the sensor that Hallie's holding in her hand here, and it goes just behind your ear. It's about the size of a nickel or so, something like that. And we took a look at the data from those concussive head impacts. And to this point, all of the literature had been done on men, where we're trying to find this threshold that if the impact goes above this particular threshold, you're more likely to become injured, right? Sustain a concussion. What we found with our data, because we were working with women, the magnitudes were significantly lower than the ones reported in the literature for men's injuries. So really what we came to think is these are really not diagnostic tools. We can't put a sticker on your helmet that will measure impact force that will tell us when you will become injured and when you won't. There's a false sense of security that low-level magnitude impacts are safe, and we just don't know that yet. And so, particularly from the women's perspective, this is the first data that I'm aware of that has published any data on concussive head impact biomechanics. So that's kind of the head impact biomechanical work that I've done. I just picked a handful of the articles. I think we have 12 publications total in that area. I believe 11 were first authors, students. So now I kind of want to move on to some protective equipment performance. Protective equipment is a piece of the puzzle. It is not the puzzle, right? And I don't know if anybody else saw the ESPN report. I believe that was last week. On the NFL supporting a new helmet for quarterbacks. And it is geared towards reducing injury for quarterbacks. Perhaps we can reduce injury risk, but we're not going to eliminate it. And so I kind of want to keep that in mind while I go through this. So this is the first set of studies that we did. These are called drop tests. So you've got a helmet on a head form. So think crash test dummy from the head up. And inside the head fits 6 accelerometers. And essentially, she's going to hit the release button, and the helmet is going to fall against the anvil on the ground, and the accelerometers measure the impact force that is transmitted through the helmet into the head. Okay? So hopefully this is going to work just fine for me. Here we go. right? And so that is called a linear drop test. And so our goal here is to measure the G-forces that occur in that helmet, and we do it at six different locations. How do I stop it? How about we just mute it? There we go. Wasn't anticipating that. I checked to make sure that they would play before I started, but I didn't make sure they would stop before I started. And so this is with Dr. Katie Breedlove. She works at Harvard now. She was working at Delaware at the time. Well, actually, she was at Purdue first, and then Delaware. And we compared lacrosse helmets to football helmets, and we wanted to see, do they have a different ability to attenuate force upon impact? So in our figures here, lacrosse helmets are in gray and football helmets are in white. And this is like golf, right? We would prefer a low score. That means that the G-forces transmitted into the head form were lower. And you can see that in several of the locations here that I have circled, lacrosse was significantly higher than the football helmets. So the football helmets had a better ability to attenuate force compared to the lacrosse helmets. Also interesting during this, if you take a look at the high velocity drops, so we did this at 3 different velocities, and you determine the velocity by how high you raise the helmet before you drop it, right? So slow velocity drops or low velocity drops, they would be closer to the anvil upon dropping, whereas the high velocity would be farther away. And if you take a look at the high velocity drops, those have to fall under 1200 GSI, it's Guide Severity Index. That is a NOXI standard that is required for helmet certification. And we were really surprised, not expecting this, but a number of the lacrosse helmets broke that 1200 threshold, which is not allowed. In addition to that, we had several of the helmets break, as you can see in the bottom pictures. The one on the left I love. The crack actually happened through the NOXI certification stamp, which is less than ideal. And in the other one, the other standard is the shell cannot crack, and the internal padding system can also not fail. And in the picture on the right, the padding came loose from the pop rivet, which would constitute a failed test. So football was better than lacrosse at attenuating impacts. Probably not super surprising. Football, there's body contact on every single play, whereas during lacrosse, if you watch some of the highlights from this past weekend, there were some pretty significant impacts, but they occur much less commonly. But still, maybe there are some design techniques we can take from football to help make lacrosse helmets attenuate force more effectively. Used lacrosse helmets. So thankfully, Coach had a bunch of used helmets out at the practice fields, and I said, "Hey, what are you doing with those?" Nothing really. So I took a handful of them and we tested them. And the new helmets are in gray. The used helmets are in white. And interestingly here, it was a little bit of a mixed bag. We were expecting the new helmets would outperform the used ones. They'd been used for 3 years. They were sitting in storage. They weren't temperature controlled. And really, what we found was that's not really the case. So we're thinking this might be a little bit more like running shoes, right? What do all of the fall athletes do right before camp starts? They all get new cleats, and then what do they have 2 days into practice? Everyone has blisters, right? You got to break your shoes in before you start wearing them. We're thinking helmets might work similarly, where that padding really needs to loosen up and fit to your head over time based on use. So the fallout of this, we actually had to notify NOXI that several of the lacrosse helmets did not pass the NOXI standard. And the Baltimore Sun ran this article. My colleague Katie was the primary person, but they referenced Lynchburg College at the time as well. And one major manufacturer had to recall a number of helmets. I believe this was 2016 or 17 would be my guess. And this happened in January, right when college lacrosse season was starting, and they had to retrofit all of them and figure out a way to make them, hit the standards. So interesting there. All right, the next thing we did was we took a look at women's lacrosse headgear. I don't know if most of you have seen these, right? So women's lacrosse is not a helmeted sport. They wear safety goggles to reduce the risk of eye injury. Well, they came out with these helmets. Well, they don't call them helmets, they call them headgear. They are soft shell. So I could take one in my hand and it would flex, right? They're not a hard shell. And so we tested these two different brands. This is Cascade on the left, and this is a rotational type of testing. It's called a pendulum test. So the anvil comes down, makes contact with the head, and the head slides on this rail system. And it's very similar to the other testing, the drop test. There's 6 accelerometers in the head, measures the force that is transmitted into the helmet. And then we also tested this hummingbird model. And you can see quite a difference there, yeah? Right? This is probably not what we would expect or want to see. Interestingly, guess which helmet performed better? Right or left? 50-50 shot. The one on the right actually outperformed the one on the left. The reason we think that this happened, when the anvil made contact with the hummingbird helmet, it shifted. And that dissipated a ton of force as it shifted instead of it going straight into the head. There are some unintended consequences perhaps of that happening, right? Some other types of injuries if that were to shift. And so, we're not suggesting that poor helmet fit is the way to go. However, the MIPS system, for those cyclists out there, ski and snowboard, the MIPS system works in this way. The helmet has an internal liner that moves independently of the shell of the helmet. And so they can work in opposition of each other, and that's kind of the technology behind that MIPS system, and that will dissipate energy upon contact. So how do we connect the dots between these two things, right? So we've got head impact biomechanics, and we've taken a look at protective equipment. How do we make sense and move forward, and what we should be doing from an injury prevention or risk mitigation standpoint? So I think behavior modification is important, right? We want to make sure that our student athletes know how to play correctly. I'm coaching U12 lacrosse right now, and one of the video clips I'm going to show next is something that the kids do wrong almost all the time. And so I'll talk about that here in just a second. Calculated risk, right? What is the risk to reward in what you are doing? And thinking about, is that actually a 50-50 header, or am I more likely to catch an elbow in the nose? Rule enforcement and modifications. We talked about those mechanisms that we found in the lacrosse games. Most of the head impacts were illegal, either stick to head or body to head, which is not permissible by rule. And so actually USA Lacrosse has come out with an increased emphasis on contact to the head. I think that happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago, somewhere in that neighborhood. Might have been longer than that. But also engineering design. How can we make a better helmet, right? And so hopefully some of the things that I've shown with the helmet testing that we've done suggest some things that we might be able to do. Maybe that MIPS system makes a lot of sense. That is very similar to the way the Vices helmet works, which is the one the NFL just supported this past week. Side impacts are common and potentially problematic because they cause injury. Maybe we need reinforced, padding on the sides of the helmet rather than some other locations that don't get impacted nearly as often. So this is a video clip from 2015. We met with the coaching staff about some of the things, right? They all came to the Student Scholar Showcase and got to hear what our students were up to. And so this is a practice clip. This midi's going to dodge the alley. And our defensive midi, this is poor technique, right? And our coaches would correct this every single time. His stick is too high, right? And he needs to be at the midfielder's hips, right? We want to ride them out of the alley at the hips. And right now, coaching U12, they're all here, right? And as soon as the offensive player lifts their elbow, their stick's going to slide up and make contact with the head, right? And so improving technique is one little thing we can do to help reduce the frequency of head impacts. Okay, so next I'm going to go into a little bit of the work that I've done on concussion. I don't have time to really go into the nuances of what concussion is, how it happens, and what the actual injury is. But what I do want to say is that it's a cellular metabolic injury, so it is invisible. We cannot see it. It does not show up on MRI, traditional MRI, CAT scans, and those sorts of things. It's a metabolic cellular injury, so we can't see it. That produces some challenges for clinicians. The first study I did, we took a look at injury rates based on what type of helmet student athletes were wearing. When I first got here, the helmets did not fit very well, and that was pretty much an industry standard. We weren't abnormal. It was one size fits all. There was no fitting mechanism whatsoever. And so, we had a couple lacerations that first year, and I was like, I wonder if this has to do with the helmet and the fact that it doesn't fit all that well. And lo and behold, we found a wide variety of injury rates depending on what type of helmet players were wearing. We also found higher injury rates in games compared to practices. Not all that surprising. This is Katie Waring. Katie Waring is actually in medical school right now at the Air Force. She is in her second year, I believe. She was a biomedical science student, a Westover student, and for some reason she chose to do a project with me. And what we decided to do was a neck strengthening protocol. We wanted to get a sense of, there's a lot of talk in the literature about neck strength being able to mitigate the magnitude that is applied to the head during head impacts. So what we did is we got a jugs machine and we fired soccer balls at our soccer players and we had them head them while they were wearing the device that measures the magnitude of the impacts. And then we did a strengthening protocol and then we tested them again. So kind of a pre-post design, it'd be a factorial design. And what we really wanted to get a look at was, did the strengthening make them stronger? Yes, it did. Did the strengthening reduce the head impact biomechanics? No, it did not. The head impact biomechanics were the same pre as post. The third thing we looked at was neurocognition. So we gave them the impact test, right? It's a neurocognitive test that we use sometimes for concussion diagnosis. We gave that to them on the front end, and then we gave it to them on the back end after the heading protocol. And we actually found that the no strengthening group's visual memory score decreased, whereas the strengthening group did not, right? So there was kind of this maintenance of visual memory that occurred that allowed them for the strengthening group score not to decrease. So long story short, neck strengthening is fantastic. Why wouldn't we strengthen the neck? I don't think we would ever tell, a soccer player not to strengthen their, quads, right? So why would we not strengthen their neck? But I think it's not a panacea for eliminating the risk of head injury. This is Deanna Smith. Deanna works at St. Albans up in Washington, D.C. And she took a look at the effect of the environment on SCAT2 scores. So the SCAT2 at the time was the gold standard for on-field injury examination, right? So how do we determine if somebody has a concussion on the field? And what we did is she worked with our club lacrosse and our club soccer teams and did the baseline version of this in a closed environment. It was my office with the door shut, so quiet. And then she also did it on the sideline during the games, right? Because that's when we would actually use it. And we found significant differences on the field versus in my office, which were not all that surprising. But we really need to think about what environment we're using these tools in to help reduce the risk of a false positive. Although I would argue a false positive probably much less concerning than a false negative, right? If we pull somebody because we think they have a concussion, probably not the end of the world. If we let somebody play who does have a concussion, that's more concerning from a long-term health risk perspective. And then we started to look at, started thinking about social determinants of health. And what are some things that maybe we don't typically think about that can alter the care that we provide? And so we partnered with Lynchburg City Schools, and we took a look at the baseline concussion data from all of their student athletes over a 10-year period. I think it was 1,500 students, maybe it was 1,700, I can't remember. And thankfully, I had met somebody in the central office, and we provided them with a de-identified data set, and they coded for whether the participant was involved in free and reduced lunch or not. And not surprising, what we found is the students who were eligible for free and reduced lunch scored had poorer scores than those who weren't on free and reduced lunch. So we need to think about things such as social determinants of health, built environment, education, access to food, when we're thinking about examining student athletes for concussion. So then I started thinking about, okay, well, this is great, but actually putting this into practice might be a little bit difficult, particularly in a higher education setting. And so I wanted to take a look at what challenges athletic trainers had when dealing with student athletes with concussion in the collegiate environment. And what we found was education efforts are only modestly effective. We think that the non-disclosure rate is about 50%. So for every concussion that we diagnose, there's one that is undiagnosed, right? Not surprising, student athletes are smart. They know that if they tell us they have a concussion, guess what? They don't get to play anymore, right? And so trying to work from an educational perspective about the long-term consequences, and when you delay disclosure, it actually takes longer to recover. It's pretty well established in the literature now. It takes about 4 days longer to recover if you delay even a day to report your injury, right? So if we can provide education on why it's important to disclose early, then hopefully we can change the narrative about disclosure. The other thing that's really complicated at the higher education level is returning to the classroom, right? Some of you have probably dealt with student athletes in your classes who have had concussions, and there's a million people you've got to coordinate with. Whereas at the high school level, there's a school nurse and there's a school psychologist. And the school psychologist makes the recommendations for what the student athlete can and can't do. We don't have a psychologist on staff that does that here, right? And so it's collaboration between our athletic training staff, our faculty athletic representative, our faculty, the student, right, to make a plan that will work for that particular individual. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end here. Right, and so education is really important for a number of stakeholders to try to improve the care that we can provide student athletes with concussions. Okay, so what about neck injury? I haven't talked about neck injury here, right? It's head and neck, or however you want to verbalize that. This is Avante Maddox. He's a slot corner for the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm a huge Philadelphia sports fan. And this was his injury from 2 years ago. As you can see, he is spine boarded. Thankfully, he was okay. He had a neck sprain and not a cervical spine injury. But you notice the face mask is removed, right? And so anytime we spine board an athlete wearing a helmet, we remove the face mask on the front end in case there needs to be CPR provided. You have to have airway access. Well, you know what? I'm standing out lacrosse practice my first year, and I'm like, so what's my plan? I had no plan. So like any good, clinician, I get into the literature, guess what I find? Nada, nothing, right? And so Debbie and I wrote a grant and got some money from NOXI, and what we found was cordless screwdrivers were the fastest tool to use. Aside from that, we got a pair of garden shears at Home Depot, and that was the second best. The FMX is a proprietary tool that is marketed for face mask removal. It costs about $150 and took twice as long to use. The Trainer's Angel is another tool that is targeted towards this task, and it took longer as well. So really what we recommended was you got to have a cordless screwdriver, but we recommend having a pair of pruning shears in case the battery dies or there's some type of complication with the screwdriver, right? So then we thought, okay, that's great, but what about used helmets? And we did a study looking at used helmets and whether we could remove the face masks. Interestingly, lacrosse uses carbon steel and not stainless steel at the time. What does carbon steel do when it gets wet? It rusts. And when the screw rusts into the T-nut and the screw spin together. Guess what doesn't happen? The screw doesn't come out, and so you can't use it. Football helmets have had T-nut walls. So this is a wall in the interior of the helmet, so when the T-nut spins, it hits the wall and it stops. Lacrosse still has not quite figured out how to do this yet, aside from one company does have this in their lacrosse helmets. And so we found a quarter of the helmets we weren't able to use just a cordless screwdriver to remove the face mask. So you got to have a cordless screwdriver, but you have to have some type of cutting tool to use as a backup in case you can't get the screw out. This is Danny Martinez, another biomedical science student. He went to prosthetic school at Georgia Tech. He fixes people for prosthetics in town now. He is back in the Lynchburg area. he took a look at, okay, that's great, but like, so can we get better at this? And we thought, yeah, practice would likely make somebody better. And what we did is we had people remove face masks once a week for 4 weeks. Interestingly, week 4 was still significantly faster than week 3. So we actually didn't hit that plateau. So maybe it's 6 weeks, maybe it's 8 weeks, I have no idea. But certainly, as you can see, practice makes perfect here. The red line is at about 60 seconds. You should be able to get airway access within 60 seconds. Okay, so face mask removal is great, but what about CPR? And lacrosse players wear equipment. And the first thing we took a look at was, okay, well, what about chest compressions, right? We have to provide high quality chest compressions. And in order to do that, we may need to take the shoulder pads off. So we wanted to know, do we need to remove the shoulder pads before doing chest compressions, or can we get 50 millimeters deep with the shoulder pads in place? Yes, we found that our participants were able to get 50 millimeters deep. So unlike football, where shoulder pads need to be removed before chest compressions, in lacrosse, they may be able to be left in place, and that would decrease the amount of time between injury and first chest compression. And really, that's a key indicator for success rate from a mortality perspective. All right, so that's chest. What about the airway? As I kind of watch sports, the chin strap gets bigger and bigger and bigger each year, it seems like. And if anybody has tried to remove a face mask, and then you've got the helmet with the chin strap on, if anyone has taken a pocket mask and tried to ventilate somebody with that big, thick piece across their chin, it's really, really hard. It's really hard. And so we took a look at some different tools here, and the King airway is in the picture all the way to the right here. It doesn't show up. King airway is here. It's a supraglottic airway. You put it down their throat, and your two-way valve for your pocket mask connects right to it. And so the air goes straight into the lungs. You don't need to worry about getting a seal around your face. So if you want to leave the helmet in place because you don't have enough people to remove the equipment, you really need to have a King airway to provide adequate ventilations. Otherwise, you're not going to be providing enough oxygen into the patient's lungs. And then we thought about, well, what about AED application? Because that's really the hallmark of saving people's lives. CPR is great, but if we can defibrillate them quickly, that's really going to be our key. And so what we wanted to see is, should we take all the equipment off first, or should we start CPR, then remove the equipment, apply the pads, and give the shock? This study was funded by USA Lacrosse, and what we found was just doing the first round of compressions on top of the pads really quickens the time to first compression. It takes a couple minutes to get all the equipment off the patient, and you're wasting a lot of time. So what we're saying is the first person on scene should go ahead and start chest compressions and tell somebody else to go get the AED and bring it. Once the AED arrives, you stop CPR, apply the pads, and give the first shock. Time to first AED application was not different between the two groups, and our chest compression depth was sufficient. And I'm going to go back just for a second. The pair of pads on the right, this was the very first pair of pads that came out that meets the Nazi standard for commodio cordis. Folks probably know about commodio cordis now that the Damar Hamlin situation happened this past year. Blunt force trauma to the chest causes sudden cardiac arrest. USA Lacrosse actually has a standard for their shoulder pads and their goalie chest protectors to help prevent commodio cordis. The thickness of that chest pad is significantly different than before the standard. But our participants were able to get the 50 millimeters with that commodio cordis plate in place. So the end result, research to practice. So now on USA Lacrosse's website, Nina Walker is the clinician for men's lacrosse at Chapel Hill. She just switched to gymnastics now, but she was our ringleader, and I have been voluntold that I am the ringleader now. And so our new iteration of guides will be out. Jason told me they'd be up this week on USA Lacrosse's website. So actually giving some ideas for current practicing clinicians. All right, so that's the past. That's what I've done. So now, okay, so what am I working on currently? So we're taking a look at lacrosse helmet, rotational testing, and very similar to the women's lacrosse headgear that I showed you the video clips of before. We've got some adult versus youth data, which I think is really interesting. The youth brain is developing. We should probably work to protect it. Thankfully, those results are fairly positive. And we also did some temperature testing. Lacrosse starts in January. It's cold. And NOXI actually has a temperature testing where you put the helmet in a freezer for a certain period of time and then bring it out and test it in that frozen state, so to speak. And my colleague Katie is heading up that study. I'm also taking a look at hockey helmets, face protection type. So there are three main categories of face protection. There is a full plastic cage, a full aluminum or steel cage, and then a half visor. The two on the left are required up through college and juniors, and the visor is required in the NHL. With some of our testing with football helmets, when we removed the face mask, the helmets did much better than when the face mask was attached. Interestingly, the NOXI standard requires the face mask to be removed upon testing. Application of the face mask makes the helmet much more rigid and increases the magnitude that is transferred to the head. So that's Tate Fonville. He works at Liberty in the Center for Engineering, Research, and Education, and I'm working with him. Their lab's out on 460. Active rehab. This is an awesome study that was funded by the NFL that we were lucky enough to be a part of. Basically, we took a look at the standard of care previous to this study was, if you have a concussion, you just rest until you feel better. And then once you feel better, you start doing things. And we wanted to challenge that and think, okay, but what if we actually treat their symptoms, right? So if you come with a headache, I'm going to treat your headache. If you come with balance disorder, I'm going to treat your balance disorder. If you come with oculomotor deficiencies, we'll treat those. And we expect to find faster recovery those completing the individual rehab programs. This is, I've been told it will be under review before the end of the semester. This is Natalie Hanno. She did a dual task activity to identify lingering concussion deficits. She used these shoe pods and had people do a dual task activity. So dual task, they are walking or running and doing some type of cognitive load. And so we're trying to measure dual task cost. How much more difficult is the dual task than the single task? And so I'm going to unmute here.
So for this trial, you're going to be running for 30 seconds and spelling random 5-letter words backwards. When I give you your first word, please go. Your first word is catch. Swing.
So basically we're asking them to do two different things at the same time, right? In sport, we never have people just jog. They have to be thinking about where the ball's coming from, where the ball's going next, where do they need to be next. And so a dual task paradigm will pick up on subtle deficiencies that we can't find with other measurement techniques. And interestingly, in the recently concussed patients, we found much slower gait and shorter stride length than matched healthy controls. So that study is under review right now in Journal of Sport Rehabilitation. The other big thing I'm working on right now is Limbic Matters. This is a large consortium that we are a part of. The ringleaders are from the University of Virginia and VCU. And basically when COVID started, basically shut down in-person data collection. And that hurt a lot of us in health sciences because that's what we do. We work with patients on collecting data. So what we did is we gathered concussion data from our electronic medical record systems over the last 10 years. So we have 13 manuscripts under review right now for a special issue in brain injury. Tanisha Helm is on the left. She's one of our second-year grad students that led one of the studies, and then Caroline is our Director of Athletic Training Services. She is leading the clinical side of this particular study here at the university. What about our ability to provide CPR? So I did those several studies on chest compression depth, right, ventilation, and the AED. We're not as good at CPR as we think we are, unfortunately. And it's all about compression depth. Folks do not press the chest hard enough to get 50 millimeters deep. Only, a quarter of the people didn't produce high-level CPR. And this should be our bread and butter. Right, emergency care is something that athletic trainers are uniquely qualified for because we're there when the injuries happen. And so we're working on this. All right, so where do I go next, right? Where do we go from here on some of the things that I'm thinking about, right? So I'm really interested in lacrosse balls. And they age over time, right? And they'll call them greasers or shiners or something like that, right? Where the ball leaks oil and plasticizers, and the outside of the ball becomes a different texture, right? It's harder to throw, it's harder to catch, and the ball is significantly harder when that happens. And there is a range that the balls need to be in between for play. And I'm interested in, if we fire those at helmets, what does that actually do from an impact perspective, right? Do the harder balls cause higher impacts? This was a picture that I caught on social media a couple years ago. A defenseman took a shot to the side of the helmet during a January practice, and the helmet shattered. But you know what? The helmet did its job. The kid was uninjured, right? But this was kind of the impetus for some of that cold temperature testing that we're in the middle of. I'm interested in CPR and the commotio cordis shoulder pads. Right now they are a standard. Every player at every level must have a shoulder pad or chest protector if they're a goalie that meets the commotio cordis standard. And this is one particular pair on the right. As you can see, the chest is completely different on this pair. Right? This is a Maverick pair that's fairly popular. It is very robust, and the size and shape of it, I'm not sure that we would be able to do chest compressions effectively. So we need to kind of figure that out. And then Sarah, who's here, is going to be taking a look at some adult and youth hockey helmet testing this summer as part of her graduate thesis. I'm also interested in helmet fit in lacrosse. It historically has been a concern, and I want to get a handle on what does that actually look like. The other thing I'm working on is a spine injury in sport group. Specific to lacrosse. So this paper came out in 2019, just before COVID started. The plan was always to have one for lacrosse. This article is for football, as you can see. And Daryl Conway is at Michigan. The two of us are leading a group that is getting some funding from USA Lacrosse to take a look at a spine injury in sport group specific to lacrosse. From a concussion perspective, we're trying to get limbic matters funded. That's kind of our number one priority there. And one of the PIs is on sabbatical next year to get funding for that. This is Alex. He's a goalie on our men's soccer team. And he's a sophomore biomedical science student, contacted me in the fall and said, hey, I want to do research. Okay. So we met, and he's like, I'm really interested in biomedical engineering. And he's been working with one of our former student athletes, Emily Maxwell. She's the coach for the Paralympic soccer team with single limb, right? And he's really interested in that. I said, all right, well, I just went to this conference in Amsterdam where we talked about concussion and kind of the challenges that we have. We don't know anything about parasport athletes, right? Some of the testing we do requires vision. That doesn't work for a vision-impaired skier, right? What about balance testing? How do we balance test somebody who's wheelchair-bound? That doesn't work. And so we're going to do kind of a two-tiered data collection. We're going to survey athletic trainers and other healthcare professionals providing care for parasport athletes, and then we're going to interview them to hear about their challenges with that population of athletes. I'm also really interested in the perceptions of consequences and disclosure or barriers to reporting, particularly at the Division III level, because it's just so different than Division I. Where Division I, maybe the expectations of what you're going to be doing when you graduate are a little bit different. I'm also really interested in how social determinants of health alter concussion care, and Empress is one of our first-year students that will be working with that on me over the next year. Think about language, right? One of our students is working in Texas, and she was just telling me the story about working with a patient whose parents don't speak English. Trying to communicate about what that person should and shouldn't be doing is a significant challenge in that particular case. So it takes a village. Thankfully, I have a village. Lots of support here from athletics, from students, from everyone, and so that's kind of what makes everything happen here. So thanks very much. Happy to take any questions that anybody might have. Jerry?
I was curious, as a scholar, but also as a coach and a father, I was curious what finding brought you the most encouragement and what one probably was the most concerning, just over your years of research.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'll take the good news first, I guess. Head impacts happen less often in lacrosse compared to football, but the magnitudes are similar, right? So in football, we get a lot of low-level impacts and just a few really high ones. Lacrosse is pretty similar. That's the good news. I guess the concerning news, I think from a research and development perspective, lacrosse still has a long way to go from a helmet perspective, where we have tried to reach out to companies in the past about certain nuances to their equipment that makes our job as clinicians more difficult and haven't really made any headway.
Tom, can you back your slide up? Yeah, there you go. Perceptions of consequences and disclosure barriers to reporting. Is that, I guess maybe one of the things, I don't know if people have looked at it or if it's something that could be looked at, but it seems to me that's a big field for narrative, right? That there are stories. This happened to my friend Jeff, and Jeff didn't get to play. This happened to so-and-so, or this athlete, or whatever. Has anybody explored that? It seems like that would be fun to look at.
Yes, and most of that data occurs at the Division I or professional athlete. There's no data from a Division III perspective. I think that's one of the kind of neat things about my career. I'm working at an institution where this type of work typically doesn't happen, right? Almost all of the literature on this type of stuff is with Division I athletes. If you look at participation rates, like nobody plays Division I athletics in college. The far majority of the participation rates are Division III, particularly the much larger sports like basketball and soccer, right? Lacrosse is a relatively small sport. It has certainly grown exponentially over the past maybe, 20 years. But I think that's the piece of it that I want to bite off. Like, okay, but what about Division III athletes who, they're studying business administration. That's their game plan when they're done. They're not really worried about the PLL draft. Now, some of our kids certainly are, right, and have done that. But for the lion's share of the student athletes we service, they're planning a career after they're finished.
Tom, I saw that report about the NFL's new quarterback helmet. I thought it was interesting that they're saying it's optional. Why wouldn't they require it? Why would the quarterbacks even need it? Why wouldn't they embrace it as well?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So, I think it's kind of like seat belts in your car. You're required to wear a seat belt, but they don't require what type of seat belt it is. The NFL requires you to wear a helmet, but doesn't tell you which one you have to wear. Now they do tell you which ones you're not allowed to wear now, right? Anyone notice Aaron Rodgers' helmet has changed over the past 5 years? Because he wore a helmet that produced or performed so poorly on the NFL standard testing that it's not allowed to be worn anymore. And the testing lab is just outside of Charlottesville. It's just north of the airport in Charlottesville that does all of that work. That's pretty interesting. So, to answer your question, I don't have a good answer for you. I can tell you this. The standards that lacrosse helmets and football helmets and hockey helmets are compared against are based on the GAD severity index, right? And that is based on the Wayne State curve. And that was, as you guessed it, developed at Wayne State by an engineering faculty member who worked with monkeys. And they provided a curve for when more catastrophic injury was more likely to occur. Skull fracture, subdural hematoma, things that will kill you. Typically, concussions don't kill people. It's a concussion with a subdural hematoma or something like that. And so as long as you're under that 300 threshold for the slow velocity drops and the 1200 for the medium and the high, what's the difference between 800 and 1000? We don't know. I would argue that lower is better, but we don't really know what's the clinical utility of that lower score. Like, if it's 800, how much higher is your risk than 500? We have no idea. So it's a complicated question, unfortunately.
Tom, I have a question.
Sure.
Thanks for a great talk. You presented some research that you said has directly led to practice change. And my question is, was that a single paper that led to that change, or was there a body of evidence that contributed to that overall change? And if it was a single paper, you don't see that in clinical medicine. You won't see that in hospital care, for example. Could that be one of the barriers to advancing effectively in the sport protection world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my answer is both. So our very first paper that was published that Debbie and I did looking at different tools to remove lacrosse face masks, there was literally no evidence in the literature to suggest what somebody should use. Literally nothing. And so right after we published that paper, folks started asking for training. Like I still go over to EC Glass every year and work with them and their students on, okay, so if you have a catastrophic injury, like this is what you should do. We did a learning lab in Baltimore at the national conference, and I think that one study kind of got the snowball built, and then the other studies rolled the ball down the hill so we could actually build the snowman, if that makes sense, right? One study didn't come to this practice guide, right? But all of the studies combined gave us some clear indication of, okay, we need a cordless screwdriver, but it might not work, so we need pruning shears. But we probably want to take the helmet off because we're the ones trained to remove it, not the ER nurses. They've probably never seen a lacrosse helmet unless their son or daughter plays. But do we need to remove the shoulder pads to do high impact? Like one thing led to another, and that's kind of how I think of research, right? It's not a destination. You never get there. You just add to it, and you keep doing things to kind of progress your line. And so, this one was from 2019. I think the first one we did was 2016, and now 2023 will be up this week. And they are each different, right? This year we added the women's helmets into the mix. We changed some of our language, and I said, you know what, this is great, but how about like some peer review? Let's do this spine injury and sport group. Let's do a proper Delphi process. Let's get experts in the room. Let's write a document for what folks should be doing, and let's get it peer reviewed and published. Coach?
I would just like to say thank you for all there's a tremendous amount of literature, hard work, efforts, your students, and that application has also gone back into our offices as coaching staff to be able to help maybe plan practices to be a little bit safer at times, with certain drills to contact and things like that. It is a contact sport, and so at a school that does not have football, we sometimes stand alone at times, and you've been able to definitely bridge that gap with all the student work and everything you've done. So I think it's made our student athletes put them in a much more safer environment. So I thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate your comments, and even when I meet with recruits to talk about, I'm the faculty mentor for men's lacrosse, but I also talk to them about the fact that we really care about student athlete well-being beyond just, hey, we've got cool facilities and you're going to get awesome warm-ups. Like, okay, that's great, but like, are you going to be safe while you're playing? And the parents tend to like that narrative, and I'm glad we're able to provide that. Anybody else? All right, well, thanks so much for coming. Appreciate everyone's time.